Hello friends, this is going to be the last session in questionnaire design. We have discussed quite a number of things, including the basic theory about questionnaire and the different response formats and the wordings, the sequencing and the administration, the editing part and data entry also. And we have also very recently discussed the different types of scales which are there. So you remember that we had discussed all these types of scales, and now is the time for us to understand what all scale choices you need to exercise when you are designing your questionnaire. So what are the important considerations while you are choosing the scale? So what are the important decisions that you have to make while you are choosing the scale? So the first important consideration or the first decision that you have to make is you have to choose between balanced and non-balanced scale. You have to use just one of them. It could be a balanced scale, it could be a non-balanced scale. Now let us understand first what is the meaning of a balanced scale and what is the meaning of a non-balanced scale. Now have a look at this question. How likely are you to buy Dettol antiseptic liquid? Now there are basically 4 different response categories. Can you tell me which of these response categories, how many of these response categories do give me an idea that the respondent is going to buy the antiseptic liquid, Dettol antiseptic liquid? There are only 2 such categories, definitely buy and probably buy, while the remaining 2 categories are telling me that the respondent is not going to buy, probably not buy and definitely not buy. Now this is a balanced versus the non-balanced scale, wherein we have equal number of positive and well as negative categories. So positive categories are definitely buy and probably buy, which means the respondent is going to buy the product, while the negative category is that particular category which tells us that the respondent is not going to buy. And here we have got 2 negative categories also, the probably not buy option, which is number 3, and the definitely not buy option, which is number 4. So this is a balanced scale. But then we can always use a non-balanced scale also. Have a look at this question. How often do you spend time on WhatsApp? Now there are 4 response categories: very often, sometimes, rarely, and never. Now can you tell me how many of these response categories are basically telling me that the respondent does spend time on WhatsApp? Very often, sometimes, and rarely. All these tell me that the respondent definitely spends time on WhatsApp, the only difference being the length of time. If the time spent is too high or too long, then he is probably going to answer very often, and if the time spent is very very short or maybe hardly 10 minutes or 20 minutes, then probably he is going to answer rarely. But whatever be the case, if his answer is 1, 2 or 3, if he picks up any one of these categories, this means that he is certainly spending time on WhatsApp. On the other hand, the 4th response choice, never, means that he does not spend time on WhatsApp. Now as far as the positive response categories are concerned, there are basically 3 of them: very often, sometimes, and really. All of them show that the respondent does spend time on WhatsApp, while the 4th category shows that respondent does not spend time on WhatsApp. So there is just one negative category, which is never, and this is a non-balanced scale because there are 3 positive categories against just one negative category. This was not the case in the first example that we took. Here we had 2 positive categories as well as 2 negative categories, and that was why this was a balanced scale. But now the question arises as to why would you want to use a non-balanced scale? See, in some circumstances, the non-balanced scale would be a better idea. It would be a better tool for us. How? You know that hardly anybody wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning to study. In fact, I believe hardly anyone among you wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning just for the purpose of studying. So if this is something that I already know because of my experience or because of some earlier research conducted by somebody else, then what will I do? I'll ask a question to my respondent. I'll pose this question to my respondent. How do you wake up at 3 a.m. in the morning to study? And then, since I know that most of the respondents are likely to answer in negative, they are going to tell me that they do not wake up at 3. So what will I do? I will use 3 negative categories while just 1 positive response category. Why? Because I already know that hardly anybody wakes up in the morning. So to take into account this particular fact that people, or let's say most of our respondents, would be answering that they do not wake up at 3. So what will I do? I'll give 3 response categories which tell me that the respondent does not wake up in the morning, while positive response category would only be 1, because rarely there would be respondents who would say that they wake up at 3 a.m. in the morning and study after that. So that is why here what I'll do, the positive category would be just 1, while there would be 3 negative response categories, and that is why this would be a non-balanced scale. Now this one, the first one is balanced scale and the second one is non-balanced scale. Now the other decision that you have to make is whether to use even number of response categories or odd number of categories. Here, now have a look at the response categories. There are 4 response categories, even number categories. So 4 response categories are there, while in the next example there are 5 response categories. There's a mistake here. Probably not is 4 and definitely not should have been 5, but it has been shown as 4 here. However, even then there are basically 5 response categories in the second example, and this is an odd number. So this is one more decision that you have to make. Now another important consideration is how many categories should be there. What should be the total number of response categories? We have been doing some online quizzes on TestMoz, and therein generally you get 4 response categories, out of which you have to pick up 1. So the important consideration here is what should be the ideal number of response categories, and the ideal number is shown to be 5 to 9. Because if there are too few response categories, the data that I will collect thus would not be able to provide me rich information. On the other hand, if there are too many response categories, let's say we have given 15 response categories and the respondent has to pick up just 1, it is going to be very much taxing for the respondent. He would not be able to understand the difference between 2 different response categories which are located close by, and it is going to be difficult for him to respond to the question posed. And that is why we generally do not go for response categories numbering more than 9, and generally we also do not go for response categories numbering less than 3, because then you would not get rich information. Okay, now Another important aspect that we have to take into account is whether you are going to go for a forced choice scale or a non-forced choice. What do we mean by a forced choice scale? Forced choice means the respondent, even if he doesn't know the answer, he does not have a choice. He will have to pick up one of the response category as his answer. While non-forced choice will have a don't know or can't say option. So if the respondent is not able to answer a question, or he feels that he does not have sufficient information, he can always pick the don't know or the can't say option. Now this is going to be an example of a non-forced choice, because you are not forcing the respondent to take a particular response category. In fact, you are giving the freedom to tell you that he does not know the answer to your question. So that is why this would be a non-forced choice. Have a look at the example. Now this is an example of non-forced choice scale. So you are not forcing the respondent to make a choice. If he is not aware of the qualities of Dettol antiseptic liquid, or he is not a user of this particular product, he can always answer don't know. Had it been a forced choice scale, it would have been very, very difficult for a respondent who has never had any exposure to Dettol antiseptic liquid. What would he have written? He couldn't have written excellent or good or average or poor. But then, since we are not giving him an option to tell us that he does not know the answer to this question, he would select one of these response categories because these are being forced on him. And that is why, in that case, it would have been a forced choice scale. Okay friends, the next thing that we are going to discuss is going to be report writing, but I am not going to talk about this in detail because we have already had a discussion on this in business communication classes. So this is what is going to follow in the next video session. In the meanwhile, you are expected to go through questionnaire design well. And why this is very important, I told you earlier also. Generally at your level, you would be doing a dissertation project or maybe a research study, and you would most likely be relying on descriptive research design, wherein you will have to use probably these surveys as a method of data collection. And to do that, certainly you will have to design a questionnaire, and that is why designing the questionnaire becomes a very, very important skill for students at your level. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed this session.